All right, folks, Everyone Loves Pirates here with your Future of the Fortress update for August 2018. As always, I have nothing to do with the development of Dwarf Fortress. I am just a big fan, and I love what Toady does here. And some people have asked for kind of a summary, me editing it down to stuff that maybe I think is more interesting, and to share that with them for people who don't have the time to go and read all the questions and answers themselves. Now, I do highly recommend you go read all the questions and answers yourself. Again, this is just a summary, so if you want any additional detail, that would be the thing to do. And as always, the links are in the description. This time around, it's about 12 pages worth of questions and answers, 12-point font and a word processor. Last time it took about an hour, but I had a lot more to do. I'm going to probably split this into 2 episodes. I'm going to see, or 2 parts. I'm going to see where we're at when we get to about the halfway mark, time-wise. But I am also just continually interested in what your thoughts are on the format of this, for those of you who watch it, and what you'd like to see, and hopefully we can together make this something that goes fairly smoothly from month to month, because I'd like to keep continuing to cover it. So without further ado, I will get to the questions. The way it's set up is quote from whoever asked the question, and then in bold, Toady's answers. And I'll try not to stumble through it too much, but it is a bit late, and I already did the other Dwarf Fortress development updates, so my voice is actually already starting to go. So we'll see how this goes, but let's get started. Quote from Tinucork. Can we expect from agents, infiltrators at any point in development to act as if they had knowledge of the consequences of their actions? Or asked in another way, what tools will these characters have to identify appropriate ways of acting? Will we see things like some traitor opening our gates to an invading army, trying to pull whatever lever should not be touched, or releasing dangerous creatures from cages? Toady answers, not wanting to give too much away. Given that vampires and grudge holders can currently file false witness reports, and vampires hide their supernatural physical attributes when they aren't in mortal danger, I suspect other such are on the table. Second part of his question, leaving aside practical examples, what limits do you expect these tools actually will have for this next release? Toady answers, the main limits for this sort of thing are time and the CPU, but beyond that, spatial analysis and pattern analysis can be tricky. Take your lever, for example. Thinking about animal release is easy. Identifying an animal release trap that would just kill the lever puller, which has been set up by some clever player, is harder. For this specific example, we naturally have been considering, given the gremlins in the game already, we had thought about having the treacherous dwarf prioritize levers that have been pulled previously. That's knowledge which it would be fair to assume for them to have, would still possibly gum up the works and also be less risky for them. The downside there would be it cutting out many levers that we want pulled. For invasion gates, the spatial analysis can be tricky, but a simple component test on a soldier versus the other side of the lever's door would be sufficient for many cases. It just has to work sometimes for it to be a good story fodder. It would be additionally good if the failed cases aren't overplayed with, for example, dramatic announcements. We'll be feeling it out as we go. All right, quote from a random dragon. So given it seems you can encounter non-questers taking the identity of a criminal, and it seems they may not always actually have a criminal record, what even is the justification for them being labeled criminals? I have encountered NPCs who don't appear to be artifact hunters, but have nonetheless assumed an identity as a self-labeled criminal, nor do they end up with an association with local criminal gangs. Toady answers, they are criminals the same way peddlers are peddlers. It's kind of hard to say. It's abstractly true, but they don't do anything yet. This is the case for all the adventure civilian dwarf-style professions as well, except for a certain few that actually contributed to stockpiles in World Gen and no longer contribute once World Gen is complete. And, you know, I've kind of let these speak for themselves, but I'll also be trying to give just kind of my thoughts on a few of these as well. Quote from Unknown72. So in the case of these deities, titans, etc. being physical, would it be possible for one to migrate petition to join a fort or integrate itself into a civ in some form physically, like becoming king, queen of the dwarfs? or even start up their own civ with themselves as the head of it. And in this case, Toady, a few of the other people in the forum kind of answered, and he quotes them. That the last part, Tinycork says, the last part about supernatural beings as civ leaders is already in play with goblin civilizations. So I guess it should be only a matter of time expanding that feature. And Rockfed says, for a while there were supernatural leaders of human civs. I don't know if they ever managed to become leaders of dwarf or elven civs, but we have seen elf, dwarf, and queen, so it might be doable. And then Toady chimes in with, yes, we used to have those impersonators more regularly, which doesn't exactly imply the real thing would ever happen, but it is certainly reasonable giving a deity with the proper body and motivations. A question from Speardorf Erith. To what extent do World Gen / mission battles currently take gear into account? I understand that it's done at least in some basic sense, but does it just compare skill / quality / material, or does it do some more complex calculations? For example, will a dwarf with a copper hammer have a good chance against an armored opponent like he does in fort mode, or will he lose because copper is a bad metal? And if I mod some overpowered one-shot kill weapon, will that be reflected in the battles, or will it treat it just like every other weapon? Toady responds, it doesn't do the same calculations that it does in in-play battles, as that would be a CPU killer, but it does use numbers based on the edge and impact fracture, I believe, for weapons and armors items that were worn on map exit. It can certainly be improved, but it can't become much more complicated at the risk of losing speed. Once we can finally move the camera to view squad battles, this won't matter anymore for the important fort-related battles. So the way I read that, if you didn't already know that, every weapon and material have edge and impact detail or that they go to. So like a steel axe is great because steel can be a very sharp, hard metal, whereas a silver hammer is better because silver is very dense, and it doesn't matter if it's sharp. It doesn't matter if it's somewhat malleable. It just needs to apply a bunch of mass to something's head, usually. In this case, he's also saying that, this may be something I forgot or I just wasn't aware of, that eventually you're going to be able to move the camera to view your squad battles that are off map. So in that case, it will do the typical, very detailed simulation of the battles that you would get when you have invaders and stuff, and it happens on your own map. That's the way I read it. Quote from A52. Having experienced quite a lot of rather exotic ones and being a programmer myself, I'm really quite passionate about bugs in Dwarf Fortress whenever I get back into it. What's the best way I can help you fix them? Is posting on Mantis kind of the limit of what is useful for you / possible for me, or are there tools I could use to narrow down causes? I thought this was a great question, especially for those of you listening who are programmers and just are interested or enthralled by bugs and want to help Toady out when they run across one. Because Toady's mentioned in the past that he doesn't get a lot of opportunity to actually play his game. So when it comes to getting bug reports, it's very difficult for him to get to a point to even get those bugs to manifest so he can see what's happening and hopefully have a much easier and better time fixing them. And he'll mention this pretty much in these two responses, but he starts with Patrick Lundell, quotes him answering it. Toady doesn't know what to do with crash dumps, so the best is a Mantis report with as much relevant details as possible, and frequently a save that demonstrates it. In particular, if the save is from just before the error is generated, so the error generation process can be followed. Unfortunately, it's frequently the case that something went corrupt a lot earlier, so all he gets out of save is, yes, the data has been corrupted somehow. The less time Tony needs to reproduce the error to examine it, the more time he's got to do useful stuff, such as fixing the problem. And I wouldn't be surprised if a bug report that looks easy to reproduce is picked over one that requires more grinding to set up when everything else is equal. And then Toady chimes in as well with, in addition, there have been cases where people have isolated causes based on diving into binaries and memory and that sort of thing as the game is running, I guess. And that's been helpful, but is quite beyond the limits of simple reporting and enters heroic territory. Also, Patrick is correct that bugs that look easier to fix are fixed faster generally, though I will spill a lot of time into crash slash etc. bugs, regardless of how patchy the reports are, if there is any kind of hope of reproducing and or fixing them. And that's a good point as well. That I believe the Mantis system allows you to attach your save files. So especially for those of you maybe like me who run seasonal saves or save often in some way with backups through DF hack, it might be worthwhile to find a save from right before you experience the issue, and then maybe even provide one from even earlier on as more of a as additional reference point. But yeah, kudos to those of you who help out with bugs and stuff on Mantis. I'll admit I never do, because by the time I run into something to search for it, it's already on there. But you know, Toady gives away the game for free. Obviously, you're encouraged to throw whatever you think it's worth at them. But one way you can give back, maybe if you don't have a lot of money, or maybe it's just you have more interest in helping fix issues, is to just submit those bugs when you run across them. All right, quote from Descan or Dscan: "Have you ever considered chopping down the title to just Dwarf Fortress? Not that I recommend or think it's a good idea. I just am curious if you ever actually thought about it and what those thoughts were." I actually was kind of wondering about this myself, so I left it in. And he says, "Yeah, we've considered it from time to time. It's certainly the most reasonable name for the game at this point. Mostly inertia, I guess. Concern for Wikipedia editors, maybe?" I don't think you should be concerned about that, Toady. I don't mind the current title either, but considering most people just call it Dwarf Fortress, I think it might not be a horrible idea, especially when it gets more towards a release on, you know, another platform besides just the website, like maybe Steam or itch or something. Quote from A52: "Now that Fortress mode is much more connected to the rest of the world, are you planning to have dwarves leave player fortresses if conditions get too bad?" Todrick says, "I recall mentioning that this is becoming more and more on the table in response to a question a month or two ago, and I think that's still true. It's almost a matter of finding a time to do it rather than needing any large features at this point." And yeah, and we covered this last month on Future of the Fortress. So it is good. I think that's a decent idea. I actually believe DF Hack has an emigration, the option where you can have dwarfs that are unhappy leave your fortress. And maybe I should try that out at some point, especially on my island hideout, which people may have noticed is not getting any more videos uploaded. It's because that save is an absolute disaster. I cannot recover from all these stressed out dwarfs. I'm still getting multiple ones just having hissy fits and starving and dehydrating themselves to death. So maybe if I turn that on, they'd just leave and I'd have a better chance of cleaning up the mess from the were-lizard attacks. Quote from Iceball3: "I understand that reconciling fort mode and adventure mode having different timescales is a current ongoing project that is being considered tentatively. Do you happen to have any ideas on how to approach an issue that will likely happen, which is that adventure mode food consumption will be much more rapid than dwarf/legend mode?" Tory replies, "Yeah, consider tentatively is almost too strong. I don't think the timescales can be reconciled, and I think it'll always cause problems. With food, World Gen already uses the adventure mode consumption levels for all sites. I think that's a good enough way to continue. This means that a player fortress by itself can't become a food exporter, but that's thematically fine. The issue maybe then becomes having abundant food outside the fort, enough for the dwarfs to live easily even in barren areas, and not having to pay/tax as much as you normally would to overcome potential starvation. And having food import be way more practical than hunting or farming. I don't think this is a major issue, though it's clearly not perfect." So I can't say I potentially want to be in a position where a player fortress itself can't become a food exporter, because that's what I tend to do for trade. Maybe I'm not playing thematically enough. Maybe I should be making dwarven metal weapons and bone totems and stuff. And I've done that in the past. But once I found out how expensive food got, it was just... And you want an excellent cook anyways. You're already making way too much food for your dwarves to eat. It just becomes the easy option for export and for trade. But, whatever he wants to do is fine by me. Obviously, this has more to do with once the economy sort of development stuff comes into play, and maybe food won't be worth that much if there's a glut of food in the world. So, again, probably quite far off, since he said consider tentatively is almost too strong. Quote from Demonic Gophers. You mentioned a dwarven mayor unusually obsessed with intrigue. That was in the dev notes, which if you saw my other video, you read them yourself, you'll remember. Does this arise from the current personality traits and values, or a new factor? Will the most intrigue-obsessed individuals carry out plans even when they don't care about the objective, just for the sake of plotting and scheming? Toady answers, this was based off of the current stuff. Values cunning, quote-unquote, values cunning, is convenient here, as well as anxiety and not trusting people. I don't yet have it as a specific hobby, but yeah, intrigue-obsessed people don't need an excuse. He also asks, villains can potentially infiltrate your fort by recruiting citizens and even officials, but will masterminds also be able to arise within the fort on their own initiative? Could a sneaky, ambitious dwarf establish and build a world-spanning conspiracy right under the player's nose, or will the network always start off-site, unless created by the player, of course? Toady says, I can't tell you if one of your own dwarfs could become a mastermind yet, as I haven't implemented the on-site agent behavior. It's actually possible that it could be possible, by accident, as it were. The dwarf in question would certainly be in the villain pool, and the recruiting code would also be active, as on-site agents will need it. Technically, that's almost all they would need. The missing element would be the ability to send people away, as we don't let your dwarves leave of their own accord yet, so they may become reliant on travelers. Once dwarves can leave, that restriction will be lifted. Quote from Spearward Aerith. Spear Dwarf Aerith again, not Spearward. In the army arc, if an off-map army is sent to defend against an invader and loses, will they retreat to your fortress, any nearby settlement, or just sort of disappear? Toady says they will likely return home if they aren't captured or destroyed, the way it works now. Question from Kitty Tack. What is your opinion on balancing DF? And it was a bit of a vague question. So he says, I really need more to work with. What are we even balancing here? It's not a competitive game, and there aren't a bunch of classes/characters like in a MOBA or something. The new magic systems will intentionally alter most aspects of vanilla balance. At the same time, we care about getting, for example, material data correct. Certain weapons like whips seem like they should be way weaker and completely impractical, but there's certainly a role for heroic individualized weapons in this genre, in which case some bit of artificial balance might be preferred. Having history always turn out the same way because one of the civs is way better than the others is a potential concern and currently a bit messed up, but the tools we use for that are partially in the magic category anyways. So kind of an overarching, just general answer about how he looks at balancing the game, it seems. And from what I've noticed, and obviously it'll be different once the Magic release and Myth release stuff comes out, he's not really all that concerned about balance, except for history of world gen stuff, just to make sure that they're not like every time you generate a world that, it's just completely filled with goblins or something like that. And of course, that'll be a lot harder with the Myth stuff. Another question from Kitty Tack. What is your opinion? Actually, we're halfway. We're only at 20 minutes, though. Okay, I'm going to try to make this a 40-minute one, and you guys let me know if you would have preferred 2 20-minute episodes. So, the question from Kitty Tack. What is your opinion on playing and starting as important historical figures such as rulers and priests? Should there be a setting for that? Will the setting default to off? Kind of along the questions that were asked last month as well. Toady answers, yeah, I'm sure I've addressed this elsewhere, how this ought to be a world setting. Defaults are complicated, and I don't have a strong opinion at this point. I can understand not wanting to be tempted to ruin a world, say, but there's also richness to certain implementations of the feature that shouldn't be ignored. Not bouncing around rulers to screw things up, though that can be fun, but playing, say, a human civ leader until death or end of the rule, and then playing as a goblin civ leader until death, end of the rule, etc. Seeing how things turn out and then play off of each other. That's the kind of fascinating experience we want to encourage people to explore. Not all characters need to be fresh in the world. That said, taking over rulers is the hardest case as it requires a lot of features we're only just now getting into and won't be far along for years and years. Nice little reminder there about how long the development of Dwarf Fortress is. I do think the loyalty party induction method isn't a bad middle ground setting between no takeovers and take over anybody, but I think they should all be permitted as settings. If someone wants to take over anybody, I don't think there should be any restrictions on what they can do, as I imagine that's the point of choosing that setting. Though, of course, there's room for two different settings here, where you can take anybody over, but there are heavy restrictions on how that works. As you say, this isn't necessarily easy when it comes to behavioral restrictions, but restrictions like must control for X years is something. If somebody wants that restriction for story purposes, suicide, etc., isn't a concern since they've opted into the rule set in the first place. So he's just talking about mainly the difficulties of, say, swapping into a ruler's body and trying to, take over the balance and the difficulty issues in doing that, as opposed to having to maybe have someone in your party for a while before you can take them over. And it sounds like he's falling on the side of both should be options, and essentially it'll be a setting you'll be able to set to choose. Really, in my mind, it seems like that's just your ability not to fall to the temptation. If you want the stricter rule set, then just play that way. You shouldn't have to worry about making it a setting. Just don't swap into anybody that you shouldn't be for your play set for the way that you want to play the game. But I don't know. I'm all for taking stuff off of Toadie's plate at this point when it's really just player agency. They can decide how they want to play it. Maybe I completely misunderstood that, though. Quote from Fantastic Dwarf. Concerning a dev goal. Specifically, the dev goal, site resources should depend on trade/tribute relationships as well as available professions and sprawl sites. And then he asks, is this currently realized in the applicable loot tables for active historical/ahistorical craftspeople on site, or is the production of tribute/resources simulated by site type or other behind-the-scenes mechanics? So Toadie answers, it's purple, which means partially complete. Up there mainly because of the World Gen site stockpiles and trade relationships. There are lots of numerically tracked goods managed in lots by source market site ID, and that's somewhat reflected in the town trade goods and why people hawking wares in the markets can say where their goods are from. I didn't realize they can do that. However, all of the personal equipment is done just according to the local goods. It looks at the regional animals, for instance, to do all the leathers. Certain reactions with alloys, though, are determined entirely by the raws, and it doesn't yet even try to check for the regions being available. So there's a lot going on, but that's only part of the way there. So it sounds to me that, it checks to see maybe that you have iron on the map to make iron for that site, where that site can make it, but additional regions being available or necessary, it may not take into account. So if I'm reading it correctly, then I would say that maybe if you can make iron, you can make steel because it doesn't look for a flux stone. But I don't know if that's what he's saying or not. I do think I've run into the past of my home civilization offering iron weapons, but never offering steel. Maybe there's some other reason for that, but yeah, it's an interesting insight. Quote from Fleeting Frames. What are the current 8 short and long-term memory categories? So Toadie answers there are 42 groupings and 8 slots. Those slots don't have types, though. The idea is just to stop one or more memory types from dominating everything, but it's possible for some weak groups to be excluded. However, all the thoughts about, say, complaints and petition rejections and not having a tomb and everything that feels like bad site government is just one category, and it's by far the largest. So parts of the game where we have a lot of odd details can't dominate the proceedings, at least. Quote from Beg. If a creature dies on an afterlife plane, what are the possibilities for what can happen to them? Toadie answers, depending on the creature in the plane, pen and paper tells us that natives of the plane generally die permanently or are reformed after X days/years. Not unreasonable. Pen and paper also tells us that souls arriving on a plane can be traded and devoured or whatever, but this is somewhat silly. It likely requires a certain sort of flair to the magic settings to cast away metaphysical notions of final judgment with such abandon, assuming some kind of final judgment, which is a common enough theme but not at all universal. I suspect we'll generally be looking toward pen and paper here and going more for a no death in the permanent afterlife vibe, oftentimes, though other possibilities will arise. Another question, will player adventurers ever be given quests by their lords/ladies to be part of an army led by someone else, and if so, how will their traveling as part of an army work? Toady says this is a problem we haven't solved yet more generally. There's nothing too wrong with just doing the Indiana Jones thing and have you move along with their asterisk on the map for as long as you cede control. And we had thoughts along these lines, even for some of the party stuff, but we're not sure yet. All right, question from Haphazard. Will the myth generator be able to generate extremely advanced/magically potent precursor races? And how will they be balanced? While it would be cool to have a race of basically omnipotent, reality-bending lizards in the myth story, if they persisted in recording history in significant numbers, it would probably be obscenely unbalanced, and they'd be able to curve stop everyone else, basically for when you can jump in and play the game. Toady says, I don't have an issue with obscenely unbalanced curb stoppers in the sense that we'll have gods, which are even worse, infinitely worse. Coming to terms with the realities of cosmological decisions will be part of the fun, and we'll have to adjust from there. If omnipotent gods make the world universally silly, maybe we won't have them in the end, but I think there's room enough to work. I think that also holds for precursors living among us. It's fine to be unpowerful if you want to play a non-precursor character, or you can play a precursor if they are still in fact around. And as Mirumar says, you do occupy a kind of middle ground already. The earlier conceptions of DF were about having humans explore stages of distance between the dwarves and tracing a few of their artifacts over time, even into a roughly modern-day analog at one point, which in itself was kind of interesting. I wasn't quite aware of that Dwarf Fortress history. But let's see. The next question, if said races are planned, just how powerful would they be able to be? As much as literal deities, building pocket planes, creating new deities from scratch, etc. Yeah, I don't think Toady says, I don't think there are any lines I'm putting up until it becomes necessary. Certain slider settings will imply active gods or godlike beings. Of course, you can just flick that off, and that might be the default if they end up being too annoying before the first release, possibly. What is the source of restraint of the involved omnipotent gods? It depends more on the author's imagination, I suppose. So having slider settings for a lot of this myth stuff, which he's talked about before, is really going to help deal with, some of the balancing issues, some of the, just having too powerful of things, just destroying everything or taking over or whatever it happens to be. Question. Again, I saw that in the current version of the myth generator, one can have mortals rise up in rebellion against deities, though they seem to always lose. Will it be possible to have a more generalized war system for the myth generator, enabling war in heaven-style conflicts between deities, groups of deities, precursors, etc., where any of the combatants can get eliminated, transformed, etc.? And Toady says, yes, I suspect this will be the case, time permitting. Quote from Thavaz regarding the recent devlog from the 18th, will the roles of families also be expanded in the world gen and fortress mode? Family ties are stronger than friendship and are underdeveloped in the game. And Toady answers, yeah, those were some of the few links we already had, so I failed to mention them in my new links rambling. Family will play a large role in the process. Question from Lord Asborn Shuta. You said in the devlog that the successful plotting, alongside beliefs and petition of target, would be determined by intrigue skill. Is it going to be a separate skill like mining or dodging, or will it be a mix of social skills like liar or diplomat? And Toady answers, yeah, this is not a perfect decision exactly, but we're leaning towards a skill right now that encapsulates certain theories of tradecraft and scheming as learnable things, the same way people can learn about making chairs. which is interesting because I would have thought it would have gone the other way. I can see how this is much more easier to implement. And to be honest, it's a kind of a pain in the butt to deal with some of these social skill stuff when you're, I can imagine it would be when you're trying to, take that into consideration when you're trying to figure out like what a dwarf's abilities would be. So I can definitely see the benefit to having it be a skill like making chairs. Question 2, you mentioned that being a criminal mastermind would be a thing soon. If option of playing Inquisitor/Detective in Adventure mode will be supported as well? Question mark. Not necessarily in full possible spectrum, but being able to discover plots via just talking with people and having the right set of skills/clues. Or occasional quests to thwart some villain agenda would be a thing that I at least look forward to. That's one I probably should have edited a bit because it's difficult to read as asked. But Toei does say, yes, the hero side of the matter will also be supported, even prioritized, though as you suggest, certain parts of that are easier to handle than others. We'd like you to be able to work your way up a villain chain to the final villain where practical. This involves not immediately killing people, perhaps, though if that proves tricky at first, we can use incriminating notes or other not uncommon video game silliness as a stopgap measure, depending on time as much as anything. Question 3, in the same spirit, if there would be fortress guests which will petition to stay in your fort to help you in discovering and preventing from villainous plots, just like monster slayers come to help you hunt down critters in caverns. Again, should have edited, but will fortress guests come and petition to help you with your intrigue? Toady says, it's a reasonable suggestion, especially if your civ leader or another fort is running counter-villain agents on some scheme that winds up at your doorstep. I'm not sure we'll get there, but it might be something I have to handle just because they will want to come, same as the bad ones. Then question 4, will we be able to choose not only what equipment to take at the start of an adventure, but what its quality would be? For instance, paying more points to have an iron longsword with asterisks around it instead of a normal one. So that's great, or something like that. Good. Toady said, I hadn't considered this at all, strangely enough, or not strangely. I'll note it down, but I can't make any promises at this juncture for the release. Same is true for fort equipment too, if I remember, and I'm not sure we ever had a reason for that. I can see restricting masterpieces to ones made by your fort, but not simple, well-crafted stuff. I think the convention has been as well that higher quality equipment is generally with a higher probability of random artistic improvements on it. It'd definitely be too much work for this time to allow you to set specific improvements, but random ones might come along for the ride. I think, you used to be able to start with them if you set your skills high enough anyways. That's part of the Master Weapon Nexer default equipment plan. Yeah, I think this is a great question. So World Embark and Adventure Mode, both, you just start with whatever you start with. You don't get to choose even your weapon. It's based off of what skills you pick. And it would be interesting to be able to sink points into getting specifically better quality weapons or whatever may be armor to better set yourself up or your starting dwarfs in Fortress mode up. It does sound like maybe the more skill you put into your ability, at least maybe in adventure mode, does affect the quality of the weapon you get. I don't know if I've ever noticed that. So maybe that's something that's just in the past, but I don't think I've ever gotten like a superior axe because I put tons of points into Axe Dwarf for my adventurer. But I do like both that option and obviously being able to choose stuff, especially based on what your civ has already made or has access to. Quote from Fantastic Dwarf, will historical figures such as monarchs weigh their foreign policy with other civilizations based on friendship with other civilization members/leaders they might want to bond/break links with? Toady says, we've had a person-person evaluation for leaders for years. It looked at family relationships and religious similarities, since that's all we had to work with. We'll be expanding that into friendship and other linkages now as we add them. I'm not sure it'll go so far as look beyond the leaders, as that sort of network scanning can get expensive, though it'll be getting some additional shortcuts this time to facilitate agent schemes, so who knows. Question from A52. Now that memories and thoughts can change personalities, will eating a particularly good/bad meal ever change food preferences? Toady says, seems like a reasonable suggestion. It used to reveal food preferences as you found them, and that made sense when there were fewer of them. Now it's like we need a broader categories and quirky exceptions and sudden realizations and all that. Question from generic user. Will personality now influence the decisions that leaders might make? For example, a patient and vengeful person might be more likely to start a plot. And Toady says, for villains, this is the case, yeah. Personality is also already influenced decision scoring for starting wars and so forth. It isn't super interesting, though, and will hopefully continue to slowly improve. Question 2, can we expect diplomatic faux pas or other things rising from the personalities of leaders and their relationships with each other? Toady says it's reasonable, but I'm not sure when. Almost all of these sort of incidental but important variations on events are missing. Just getting the skeleton has been a lot of work, but the variations are crucial as well. Question 3, with villainy being fleshed out, can we expect someone gaining enough power to start a civil war, create their own empire? Toady says it's not something that's supported yet. The law, status, etc. release includes definitions for subgroups to allow this to happen more formally in a way people can talk and think about succinctly. The current entity structures don't work. However, starting wars and having informal power over everything are quite likely, so sort of a soft yes. Question 4, would dreams' goals influence plots? Say if there is a person who dreams to rule the world, they may hatch a plot to hold the world in their iron grip. Toy says this is reasonable. There are new sets of short-term goals, but I really should make use of the ones we have. Question from Beg, and we're getting quite near the end now. What sort of laws/religious stuff do you think needs to be added specifically for the villain update? Toady says, don't know yet. Priests exist as historical figures at sites, but they don't do anything or form special links. Any links would be exploitable. Even a recognition that the priest is of the proper religion would be useful. Law stuff is really all over the place. It influences reasons relationships can sour. Villains have a general disdain, but also use for them. And we also might need new ones for the fort investigation to have teeth. But as I've said, it's not clear exactly what we'll be adding to World Gen from our grab bag to get plots properly varied. That's happening presently, and I'll add what I need. I'd hoped to know by now, but August was what it was. You can read more about Toady's issues with August in the devlog. Will criminal organizations inside the same town or city fight each other? He says, fight is a strong word. I'm not sure what new violence we'll have here overall, but any two schemers would initially be at odds. That might not remain this situation as their plots progress and intersect. Question 3, will this change in the number of criminal organizations per town or city open up more kinds of missions for player adventurers in these groups? Toady says, I suspect, though the role of adventurer as villain subordinate is still up in the air due to the conversation stuff I think I mentioned previously. Just a time thing, though we're all for it. Question 4, in the villain update, how much will laws vary between civilizations, and will there be a way for the player adventurers to find out what those laws are? Toy says, I don't think laws are going to be so firmly established and all-encompassing in this release. There is still the actual law release. I'm working more for convenience this time. And then the last question from Tinacork. Right now, the thoughts and preferences screen is the main tool the player has to control and manage happiness in the fort. Can we expect for this to change once proper site administrations are implemented and dwarfs, individually or collectively, and besides the nobles, can make requests or demands? And Toady says, I'm not sure exactly when to expect changes there. Clearly some sort of aggregation is needed, especially when the reading burden for the individual thought screen becomes too high, which is arguably already true for the starting 7. Part of the idea was to handle it with subgroups. Once there's a miners guild, say, they can naturally aggregate happiness requests for their members, and it would become part of the fortress politics to handle those parts of the game. This would be something I would be extremely excited to see. Obviously, it's not imminent, but I do enjoy going into my dwarf's thoughts, and with my most recent fortress having such a stress spiral that I was continuously going in trying to figure out how can I make this dwarf happy? What are they still angry or harrowed about? And a more centralized way to manage all that and to quickly look at it instead of going from dwarf to dwarf. I mean, even with Dwarf Therapist, it's a bit of work. So yeah, something centralized would be great, and making it work in a way of dwarfs naturally grouping up. Kind of, in my reading, it sounds like kind of like factions in other games. For instance, like, I don't know, Stellaris, where you have different factions and you can make them happy, and if you do, they'll reward you with influence. But in this case, I think thematically it works quite well. That, you know, maybe all the minor dwarfs are quite interested in any particular sort of issue. They probably don't like to get rained on, for instance, so they may want to stay inside, or I don't know what it might be. But you know, the military dwarfs might have particular requests for you know, decent beds or good armor or something like that that will give them happy thoughts. Again, it's not my game. I don't develop it, so I don't know exactly what direction he's looking in, but I can see the potential, and I like the idea of, oh, well, let's check in with the union leader over here and see what all the you know, these worker dwarves, what their gripes are, and you kind of have this collective bargaining sort of session where you can maybe promise them stuff. I don't know what it'll look like, but I like the opportunity there, and I'm interested in seeing how that turns out eventually. So yeah, we're just over 40 minutes. Again, please let me know if you would like them to be even shorter than this. This is much better than an hour, but I understand 40 minutes is a lot for some people. Don't think I'd break it up to less than 20 minutes an episode, which is why I was a little hesitant to do so. But I was right. I was at the halfway mark. So again, let me know the format you like to see these. Those of you who watch this and want to continue to see it happen. I will very strongly take any of your suggestions into consideration for future videos. All right, links are in the description if you want to read any of this stuff yourself, and I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Bye-bye.